everyone. I'm Barry Stagner, and this is The Lineup. This program looks at the events of the world through the lens of Bible prophecy, and we've had another busy week in the news, as we could say every single week. But a couple of things before we jump in. One, I'd ask you to consider liking and sharing our Facebook page. As I've talked about in the past, we are so heavily restricted, and the limited number of people that are allowed to see the posts, including the messages given at the church, is so minuscule. It's just ridiculous. So we would really appreciate your help in liking and sharing this video and any others that may be a blessing or encouragement to you. And regarding that, this coming July 14th, on Wednesday, July 14th, I'm going to be starting a series at the church, Calvary Chapel, Tustin, titled The Time of the Signs. And we're going to look at the biblical perspective a little more in depth than we do on this program, where we try and cover as many relevant news stories as we can. But we're going to look at at least six at this point, specific elements of prophecy that tell us we are indeed living in the time of the signs. And all this began back on May 14th, 1948. And our first message is going to be titled Born in a Day, Israel, God's Timepiece. And we'll look at the specific relevance of Israel in the last days scenario and why they are important, why the church hasn't replaced them, and why we need to understand their role in Bible prophecy on a few different planes. But we'll look at that in great detail. So again, you can watch here on this Facebook page. You can watch it on YouTube. You can go to cctustin.org and live stream. And again, that's July the 14th, 7 p.m. Pacific time, at Calvary Chapel, Tustin, if you'd like to come and join us live. Our new sanctuary is still under construction, so we're meeting in our fellowship hall. But come on out. We'd love to have you as we look at the time of the signs and all the things happening in our world. Now, as I said, there's no way we can cover everything in a single week's program that's going on in the news. So I've tried to hone in on several topics that will bring our mind's eye to what's happening in the world and how things are escalating as it relates to Bible prophecy. And as always, I just want to encourage you, even though we look at many things that are discouraging and disheartening, there are all signs that Jesus is coming. So let's keep our eyes on the prize, our heads lifted up, knowing that he is coming for his bride, I believe, very soon. Now, we do know that there has been a governmental change in the state of Israel. It is the government of change, is how it's been billed. And interesting that the state of Israel actually posted on Instagram just this week that they have the most diverse government in their history. And they said, for the first time, we have a religious prime minister. We also have the most women or females ever in the Knesset, 9 in number. They also boasted that this new coalition government has 2 Arab MKs in it, as well as 2 openly gay male individuals. So diversity is the order of the day, and we see that happening all around the world. Now, I want to focus in for a few moments on this religious aspect of the prime minister, because I believe this has a major prophetic, potentially a major prophetic implication. Now, there's been a lot of talk about, Netanyahu and him being a nationalist and him being pro-Israel and the many amazing and wonderful things he has done for his country. And yet this coalition gathered together for the single purpose of ousting him. But there is, as I said, potentially a prophetic element to this. And the first story we're going to look at this week comes from the Washington Post. And the headline reads, "What to Know About Naftali Bennett, Israel's New Prime Minister." We're told after 15 years in office and a run of 4 deadlocked elections, Israel's longest-serving Prime Minister, Benjamin Netanyahu, was unseated on Sunday by a coalition of opposition parties united by little beyond the desire to replace him. Naftali Bennett, the country's new prime minister, is set to hold office for 2 years before handing off to Yair Lapid, a centrist politician. And though Bennett's party trailed far behind both Netanyahu's and Lapid's in the last election, a riding push to oust Netanyahu in divergent quarters amid political deadlock allowed Bennett to emerge as a key power broker. Then the article asks, what are his policies? The first is, though he does not live in the West Bank, Bennett has made annexing parts of the Palestinian territories a core part of his political program. Like many other top politicians in Israel, Bennett takes a hard line against Iran and supports liberal economic policies. He's also known for incendiary anti-Palestinian rhetoric. In 2015, he referred to the prospects of a Palestinian state as suicide for Israel. And in 2014, warned Arab citizens against becoming a fifth column. In another controversial statement in 2013, Bennett said that the Palestinian terrorists should be killed, not released. Bennett has expressed support for increased Jewish control over the Temple Mount compound, known by the Muslims as the Noble Sanctuary in Jerusalem's contested Old City. Israeli police attacking Palestinians praying at Al-Aqsa Mosque last month in part sparked a wave of unrest and Israel's 11-day war with Hamas in the Gaza Strip. Now, obviously, this is a secular newspaper reporting on things from their view. Now, the interesting thing about this is followed up by the next story that comes from Israel 365 News. And the new prime minister calls on Israel to not make the same mistakes that destroyed the temple. Israel's 36th government passed a vote of confidence at a special Knesset section with Yamina Party head Naftali Bennett sworn in as Israel's 13th prime minister. Although he accused Israel's leadership under Netanyahu of being a failure, the overall theme of his speech was a call for unity. To emphasize his point, Bennett invoked the destruction of both the first and second temples, saying, "There have been times in Jewish history when disagreements are out of control, when the disagreement is no longer for heaven's sake, when it threatens us and all that we have built." And referring to both the first and second temples, Bennett added, "Twice in our history, we lost our national home precisely because the leaders of that generation did not agree." And according to Jewish legend, the second temple was destroyed by God due to baseless hatred, whereby the Jewish people conspired against one another out of spite. Now, I think the reason we need to understand the importance of the potential prophetic importance, especially of these two opening stories, is Bennett's outlook regarding the Temple Mount. He wants to see more of an egalitarian position on the Temple Mount, where the rights that are enjoyed by the Muslims who go up there to pray are also available to Christians and Jews. If you've ever been on the Temple Mount, you know that as a tour group, you're not allowed to stand in a circle. You're not allowed to take a posture of prayer. You're not allowed to read the Bible. You can only discuss historical, according to those in control. You can only discuss historical events or features of the Mount, and nothing spiritual outside of what's taught and believed by the Muslims can be done on the Temple Mount. Now, Bennett wants to see that change. And it's interesting if we consider what's taking place in the world scene as it relates to Bible prophecy. We see from Zechariah chapter 12, verse 3, that Israel and Jerusalem are going to be the focal point of world attention in a negative way. We talked about that in the past couple of weeks. But the real potential fuse that lights the powder keg in the Middle East is the Temple Mount. Now, there's comments that have come out of Turkey recently. Jordan has made some rather incendiary comments regarding the Temple Mount and the control and the maintenance of the status quo. So now you've got a prime minister in Israel who himself has kicked up some dust in time past regarding the Temple Mount and the Jews' right to have a presence there. So it'll be interesting to see what he does in his opening 2 years, or his 2 years as PM of Israel. And there's a possibility that things could heat up around the Temple Mount. Now, there's a lot of spokes on that wheel, and people often ask the question, when exactly is the Isaiah 17 destruction of Damascus going to take place? What's the timeline for the Ezekiel war and the invasion from the north of the coalition forces that are already largely present there? And there's got to be something that is the hook of the jaw that draws these armies down out of the north. And it's possible that the destruction of Damascus is the hook in the jaw. It's also possible that a change in the status quo on the Temple Mount could be the proverbial final straw that breaks the camel's back, that draws this coalition force down out of the north. But it's worth noting that in the midst of all the things we're hearing and all the upheaval that's being proposed there in Israel regarding this new change government, the head of this government, at least for the next 2 years, is a deeply religious man, and therefore he sees the Temple Mount as pivotal in allowing Israel to enjoy what is rightfully theirs and the right to worship there. Now, in opposition to this, the Times of Israel says Mansour Abbas, the headline says, the flag march is an unbridled provocation that should have been nixed. And the head of Islamist Ra'am, part of the new government, says the Jerusalem parade is based on incitement to violence and is an attempt to set the region on fire for political reasons. Mansour Abbas, the leader of the party, which provided the key support to establish a new government in Israel earlier this week, said Tuesday that the contentious flag march in Jerusalem should not have been allowed to go ahead. This is a celebration of the capture of East Jerusalem on June 7th, 1967. The flag march in Jerusalem today, the article goes on to say, is an unbridled provocation which is based on shouts of hatred and incitement to violence and an attempt to set the area on fire for political reasons. The public security minister and the police should have canceled it. And new public security minister Omar Barlev said on Monday that following his meetings with police, the march would go ahead as scheduled, and the nationalist parade, rescheduled after the original event on Jerusalem Day, May 10th, stopped short by Hamas rocket fire at Jerusalem, is expected to be the first major test faced by Israel's new government, which was sworn in on Sunday. So again, we see this 35 acres becoming the world hotspot and a potential fuse that lights the powder keg of the Middle East. And one of the new party members of the coalition government from the Arab Party is already protesting the fact that Israel is making any claim to having a right to any part of the old city. Now, the Times is also reporting that Bennett, the traitor liar flag march, sees chance posters directed at the new prime minister. And some right-wing Israelis denounced new Prime Minister Naftali Bennett as a traitor during an ultra-nationalist parade Tuesday through parts of Jerusalem's old city. In one incident, backers of foreign Premier Benjamin Netanyahu's Likud party chanted, "Bennett the traitor," during the Channel 12 news broadcast. The network cut away from the Likud supporters as they continued to chant. They also repeatedly chanted Bibi, the former prime minister's nickname. Posters of Bennett with the text, "Bennett the liar," were held up by a number of participants in the contentious flag parade, which also saw some marchers chant, "Death to Arabs," and "Burn down your village." The posters apparently referred to Bennett's breaking of his pre-election pledge not to form a government, in which he switched off the partnership with Yesh Atid's Lapid and not to rely on the Islamist Ra'am party support. As we mentioned, there are two Knesset members from that party that are part of the coalition government. Netanyahu's own brother-in-law doubled down, calling Bennett a traitor. And when he was asked by Channel 12 if he wanted to reverse the use of his terms in his interview, he said, "I'm a Bible teacher, and therefore I use the word that the Bible uses to describe cooperation with traitors. The reality must not be obscured," said Hagi ben Artzi, Sarah Netanyahu's brother. He also claimed the new government is illegitimate from a Zionist, nationalist, and Jewish perspective, and called Bennett and Interior Minister Ayelet Shaked, the number two in Yamina, a pair of swindlers and traitors. Now, we've been talking in the past couple of weeks about the prophetic necessity of instability in all governmental systems around the world, which increases the cry of peace and security that the world is going to be unified under, and therefore they'll be ready for the man of sin, the son of perdition, when he rises to power, solves the Middle East crisis, makes a covenant with Israel for the duration of 7 years, as Daniel chapter 9 prophesied, and then breaks the covenant in the middle of the week. We see all of these things feeding into that day, which I again believe is not too far off. Now, Israel 365 is reporting the religious party vows war against the new government for trying to alter Israel's religious status quo. The United Torah Judaism lawmakers were enraged to learn on Wednesday that Israel's new government plans to set up a special committee to review the long-standing religious secular status quo in Israel. And the panel is set to be formed under the auspice, under the uh, under the guise, of the Religious Services Ministry, and is expected to look into controversial matters such as conversion, kashrut, commerce on the weekends, and public transportation on Shabbat. It turns out the prime minister doesn't only break his campaign promises, but also breaks his word in office, said UTJ lawmaker Uri Maklev, referring to Prime Minister Naftali Bennett's statement that the government was unlikely to revisit the issue of the status quo. And United Torah Judaism leader Moshe Gafni said in response to the development that there will be a war for every T crossed and I dotted, and God willing, we will topple this evil government. Now, again, here you see division, much like we're seeing here in the United States. You've got efforts to topple the current administration in our country. You've got the same thing happening in Israel. And again, this points to the political instability that is really, I believe, a prophetic necessity that opens the world to just being willing to accept a man who the Bible has long for over 2,000 years has prophesied will rise to power in great detail in the book of Revelation. And even years before that, 700 years or so before that, in the book of Daniel, we see the same thing being prophesied. And yet the world is so far from God at this point in time that they would be willing to accept a man who we're given great specific details about. According to Daniel 11, he's a smooth talking flatterer. He has slippery speech. He deceives the world with what the Bible says is intrigue, and that word literally means flattery. And he basically flatters the world into subjection to him. Now, the Jewish News Syndicate is reporting that Israel's birthplace switched from Jerusalem to occupied territories on the new UK passport. And Jerusalem-born Ayelet Balaban, a dual Israeli-British citizen who has held a UK passport all her life, was shocked on receiving her new passport. Balaban's old and new British passports, upon renewing the document, Balaban, who holds dual citizenship, compared the two documents and was surprised to discover that her place of birth had been changed from Jerusalem to occupied Palestinian territories. Israel's foreign ministry is investigating a report that this had taken place, or the report that this had taken place. And Balaban, this dual Israeli-British citizen, is still struggling to understand how these two countries, or her home country, could do this. And according to Balaban, she sent her old passport to England about 2 weeks ago and received the new one on Monday. And upon discovering the change, she checked with her brother, who renewed his British passport 2 years ago, and it still listed his place of birth as Jerusalem. Balaban sent a letter to Israel's ambassador to the United Kingdom, Zippy Hotovli, and on Tuesday, but said she hasn't heard back yet. Inquiries have also been sent to the British Embassy in Israel. So once again, here we see the international attitude towards Israel. There's been dramatic changes on many levels. We'll talk about some of those here in a few moments after this 11-day exchange between Israel and the Palestinians. And we do know that, since this Jerusalem Day parade has taken place and they finally had their flag parade, at this point in time, there's been some 26 fires from incendiary devices that have happened in the nation of Israel, yet we don't see any international outcry about that. But we see this type of thing happening all around the world. Now, another interesting story, and I find this to be fascinating because within the Abraham Accords and all of the things that have been talked about as President Trump brokered this particular element along with Prime Minister Netanyahu, and all the prophetic implications that have been discussed. ties with the Sudan was a bit of a curiosity. And I think most of us at that time, because the Sudan is named in the invading coalition force of Ezekiel 38 and 39. And by the way, let me just give you a little insight here. When you run across the name Ethiopia, you have to understand that from the biblical perspective at the time it was written. Ethiopia simply means territories south of Egypt, and that obviously would be the Sudan. So when you read Ethiopia, don't think of the modern nation of Israel, think of Sudan. And so with them entering into efforts to normalize relations with Israel, that was a little bit of a head scratcher with the Ezekiel war scenario and the coalition forces named there. But the Times of Israel is reporting Sudan is disappointed with the results of normalization with Israel. Now, this is an interesting article, so pay attention and note what is the motivation between these efforts, or for these efforts, I should say. Israeli report says sources in Khartoum bemoan insufficient U.S. investment. There's the motivation. Saying greater funds would lend more legitimacy to Arab nations joining the Abraham Accords. In other words, you need to pay for us to agree. Sudan is disappointed with the outcome of the normalization agreement with Israel amid insufficient U.S. investment in the African country, according to an Israeli report Wednesday morning. Many months after the deal was signed, Washington hasn't fulfilled its promise to invest in agriculture and technology projects in Sudan. The Khan public broadcaster cited senior sources in Khartoum as saying. The sources noted that the normalization had been controversial inside the Sudanese government, and considerable financial investments would have helped market the agreement to the public. In January, Sudan signed on to the Abraham Accords with the United States, paving the way for the African country to normalize ties with Israel. The signing came just 2 months after then U.S. President Donald Trump announced that Sudan would start to normalize ties with Israel. Before Sudan, the Trump administration engineered diplomatic pacts late last year between Israel and the UAE and between Israel and Bahrain. Morocco also reestablished diplomatic relations with Israel after cutting ties in 2000 in solidarity with Palestinians during the Second Intifada. Now, again, this is curious because really basically what the Sudanese officials are saying is, we'll sign on to this normalization if there's enough money in the bank. And again, with, all the things we're seeing happening in the world, all the changes that have happened in our own country and the foreign policy changes that are happening under the new administration here in the United States. Who knows where this is going to lead and if that financial demand is going to be made. But something is going to happen that is going to push the Sudanese out of this agreement because, as I said, they are part of the coalition force that invades Israel from the north. So interesting that this particular element is the catalyst, potential catalyst of the breaking of that relationship, U.S. dollars not flowing fast enough. Now, obviously, we all hear so many things about what's happening with the globe, and we've had global warming that was basically morphed into climate change, a broader phrase that covers any type of change in the weather, so to speak. And there's an interesting component to this that we need to highlight that is happening in our day, and it comes from the zero hedge. And one bank says environmental social governance score could trigger hyperinflation. In a recent blog post from Dun & Bradstreet's Francis Yared, the credit strategist looks at one of the lesser discussed drivers of inflation and points out that supply shocks to oil prices have historically been relevant for inflation expectations. Now, as Yared writes, supply shock to oil prices have had a significant impact on inflation expectations on 3 occasions in the past century. In the mid-'70s, and any of you who have been around long enough to remember that, were driving a car, remember that there was a time where you could only get gas based on the calendar date and the last number in your license plate. If it was an odd number, you could only get gas on odd numbered days. Even it was the same. So in the 70s, 80s, and the mid 10s, we've had major shock changes in oil prices. The article goes on to say, however, unlike the infamous price explosions of the 70s and 80s, the latest episode was the shale oil revolution, resulting in a significant positive supply shock to oil markets, which led OPEC in 2014 to defend its market share rather than change oil prices or raise them. The downward pressure on oil prices, Yared writes, resulted in a shift to a lower inflation regime, which was reflected in both consumer and market inflation expectations, as well as monetary policy expectations and term premium. Well, not anymore, because the environmental social governance revolution is unwinding the shale oil shock impact. As recent events at Exxon and Shell have shown, the pressure on oil companies to reduce oil and gas exploration and adapt their business models has increased significantly over the past few months. And this is reflected in crude rig counts that have lagged the recovery in oil prices and stand at 1/3 of the 2014 peak. Now, in an earlier article on April 5th, Zero Hedge said the ESG is now added to a growing list of authoritarian controls that are being implemented around the world. The list at that point in time was headed by social credit score. Now, this is something that we've talked about in time past, something that has been going on in China that is now spreading to the rest of the world. And a social credit score is based on your personal behavior. And some of the control mechanisms are that have been introduced are internet speed. In other words, if your social credit score is low, the government will reduce the speed at which you can download or watch internet service, and basically controlling everything that you can do, all based on your social credit score. If you get arrested, it'll be a drop in your, or get a ticket, there'll be a drop in your score. If you have any relationship with any type of anti-government group or action, your score, your social credit score is going to be reduced. And secondly, they then list the environment social governance score. This is a lot like the cap and trade push that we saw some years ago. And if your overall governance score is low or impacted by your environmental actions, then that is going to affect you as a country, and there'll be fines for that country. And once again, the old cap and trade just under a new banner. Global tax based on your ESG score is the next component of world control or authoritarian controls, and they're shutting down oil exploration. Government-run healthcare is on the docket. A cashless society or a central bank digital currency, and vaccine passports and universal basic income are round out the list of things that are moving forward by the World Economic Forum and the Great Reset. That the date keeps getting pushed back, but COVID had a lot to do with that. But it's interesting that these efforts are still moving forward. The article concludes by saying, when we factor in programmable central bank digital currencies and a dependent middle class on the government dole, the SCS, or the social credit score, and the ESG, or the environmental social governance score, will become like a giant boot on the neck of a completely dependent society. We could just describe this whole article in a word, and that would be socialism. The government controls all things. And we see, sadly, here in the United States, a movement toward that. The government has all the answers. And again, this is all feeding into the fact that there is coming a man who is going to say, I do have the answers. I can solve the Middle East crisis. I can deal with these international issues and bring about that elusive peace and security that the world is clamoring for. Interesting that Breitbart reports that the Biden administration asked Americans to report potentially radicalized friends, and guess what? Family. That's what Jesus said was going to take place, that A household will be divided, a father against son, mother against daughter or daughter-in-law. And Joe Biden's administration announced their plans to create ways for Americans to report radicalized friends and family to the government, and get this, in an effort to fight domestic terrorism. In a conversation with reporters, one senior administration official explained the importance of stopping politically fueled violence before it started. We will work to improve public awareness of federal resources to address concerning or threatening behavior before violence occurs, the official said. The official cited the Department of Homeland Security "If You See Something, Say Something" campaign to help stop radical Islamic terror as well as a domestic possibility. This involves creating context in which those who are family members or friends or co-workers know that there are pathways and avenues to raise concerns and seek help for those whom they have perceived to be radicalizing and potentially radicalizing towards violence, the official said. President Biden began his presidency with a stark warning in his inauguration speech about the rise in political extremism, white supremacy, domestic terrorism that we must confront and we will defeat. And on June 1st, Biden described the threat from white supremacy as the most lethal threat to the homeland today. Now, again, the January 6th breaching of the Capitol grounds by protesters is always in the minds and basically the motive behind such statements. But it's interesting that we're seeing what the Bible has predicted now becoming fact here in these United States. The Department of Homeland Security also plans to deploy digital literacy and digital fitness programs to help combat malicious content online that bad actors deliberately try to disseminate. So once again, control the media, control the narrative, control social media, have people rat out their own family members who obviously the goal of this is to silence any comments about the government. And again, this is nothing but communism and socialism, and it's being forced upon us as the Bible has predicted, that the world is going to move in that direction. Again, preparing for the Antichrist. Now, I keep bringing that up for a reason, because we need to remember how close we actually are. The Jews are back in the land and have been for some 73 years. We see the perilous times that Paul predicted are upon us, the defection from truth that he wrote to the church at Thessaloniki is happening, and people will not endure sound doctrine. There's a global shift to egalitarian thinking, egalitarianism, simply meaning that everybody has to have not just the same opportunity, but the same outcome. An equal outcome is the mantra of the day. And therefore, we, the government, they say, have to be able to control everything. And you, the people, have to report to us those who are working against our cause. Now, here's an interesting story. Actually, it comes out of Fox News, and I actually read it on several mediums. But here's the interesting part. I think Fox covered the story best. Lessons from a North Korean defector. U.S. schools have become brainwashing centers. A long time ago, the left decided that one of the best ways to transform U.S. society would be to take over the education system, and that conquest is now complete. From the very top to the very bottom, the left completely and utterly dominates our system of education, and at this point, our schools are little more than public indoctrination centers. Yunomi Park knows what real oppression looks like. She was born in North Korea. By the age of 13, she had literally witnessed people drop dead of starvation right in front of her eyes. Thankfully, she was able to escape North Korea for a better life. In 2016, Park transferred from the university that she was studying at in South Korea to Columbia University here in the United States. Initially, she was very excited to be able to study in this country, but once she started attending classes, she quickly realized that even North Korea, listen to this statement, even North Korea isn't this nuts. She had long viewed the U.S. as a country of free thought and free speech until she went to college there. All over the world, people used to look to America as a beacon of freedom, But we haven't been a beacon of freedom for a very long time, the article says. And Park came to this country expecting to, quote, learn how to think, end quote. But instead, she says that her professors were trying to force her to think the way that they think. I expected that I was paying this fortune, all this time and energy, to learn how to think, but they are forcing you to think the way they want you to think, Park said in an interview with Fox News. I realized, wow, this is insane. I thought America was different, but I saw so many similarities to what I saw in North Korea that I started worrying. This is one of the big reasons why so many of our young people changed so dramatically after going away to college. The entire system is designed to indoctrinate you to believe certain things. And most young people that attend college simply go along with the program. And it's very difficult for those that want to think independently to go against the current. And those that are vocal about their objections often become targets for persecution. Well, obviously, we've seen radical changes in our country. And really, I think this has been something that has just baffled me for many, many years. Why things that a generation ago were illegal and could lead to prosecution are now protected, allowing college professors to indoctrinate students into communistic thinking and Marxist thinking and socialist beliefs and pursuits. And yet nothing has been done about this. When a generation ago it was illegal to be a communist, and now it's openly promoted here in these United States. And sadly, we've really, in a sense, lost a generation to this. And that's why also we've noted that past administrations have promoted going to college. They've offered forgiveness for college debt and all these other things to get people into these quote unquote indoctrination centers. And we are seeing the consequences of that. Now, off to some military news, and this would all fall under the wars and rumors of war category that we know is part of the last days scenario. And the Associated Press reports that China has sent a record 28 fighter jets toward Taiwan. China flew a record of 28 fighter jets toward the self-ruled island of Taiwan on Tuesday. The island's defense ministry said the largest such display of force since Beijing began sending planes on a near daily basis last year. Taiwan's Air Force deployed its combat air patrol forces in response and monitored the situation in the southwestern part of the island's air defense identification zone with its air defense systems, the Ministry of National Defense said. The planes included various types of fighter jets, including 14 J-16 and 6 J-11 planes, as well as bombers, the ministry said. China's show of force comes after leaders of the Group of 7 industrialized nations issued a statement Sunday calling for a peaceful resolution to the Taiwan Strait issues and underscored the importance of peace and security. Chinese Foreign Ministry spokesperson Zhao Lijian on Tuesday said the G7 was deliberately interfering in China's international affairs. Interesting, Zero Hedge follows up with a story that says the USS Reagan Strike Group enters the heavily disputed South China Sea. The great power competition between China and the U.S. continued Tuesday as the Ronald Reagan Carrier Strike Group sailed into the South China Sea for the first time this year, according to a U.S. Navy press release. The Strike Group's aircraft carrier, Reagan, was accompanied by the guided missile cruiser, USS Shiloh, and the guided missile destroyer, USS Halsey. The group of vessels entered the heavily disputed South China Sea waters on Tuesday to conduct a maritime security operation. The Navy said upholding freedom of the seas in the South China Sea is vitally important. Now listen, where nearly a third of global maritime trade, roughly $3.5 trillion, a third of the global crude oil, and half of global liquefied natural gas passes through the sea each year. Now, obviously, this isn't simply a territorial issue. This isn't simply a border issue. This is a financial issue, and this is about $3.5 trillion worth of controlling global economies. A third of the world's oil passes through the South China Sea. So once again, like we often see in the Persian Gulf, and efforts to shut down the Strait of Hormuz is an effort to control international events and demand a reaction of some sort. We've seen that happen in the time past, but now we've got it uh, on a much grander scale, if you will, happening in the South China Sea. Interesting, the Star Advisor, a Hawaiian newspaper, reports that the Russian Navy west of Hawaii prompted F-22 fighter launch from Hickam Air Base, the report says. And the Russian Navy is edging closer to Hawaii with a big exercise 300 to 500 miles west of the Aloha State, prompting the Air Force to scramble three missile-armed F-22 fighters on Sunday. Russian officials said it's the largest exercise in the Pacific since the end of the Cold War and involves surface ships, anti-submarine aircraft, and long-range bombers, the news outlet reported. Citing U.S. defense officials, the United States scrambled the F-22s from Hawaii on Sunday in response to Russian bomber flights, but the aircraft did not enter the air defense identification zone. In other words, they didn't have to contact each other and were not intercepted. At the same time, officials said a U.S. carrier strike group headed by the USS Carl Vinson is operating about 200 miles east of Hawaii, conducting a strike group certification exercise. The exercise had been planned but was moved closer to Hawaii in response to the Russian exercise. The exercise comes ahead of the meeting between Biden and Russian President Vladimir Putin, which is now taken place, and there's multiple news stories on that. I'm sure many of you have seen. Now, interesting that we see these things happening, and you always have to wonder, much like we've talked about with the Ezekiel war scenario and the Isaiah 17 destruction of Damascus. One of these encounters, all it takes is a trigger-happy pilot or a mistake even to ignite a war between world powers, and that falls under that category of what Jesus said is going to increase in the last days in a birth pang-like progression. That is wars and rumors of wars. And it seems like between China and Russia and the United States and the many of the exchanges between Turkey and Israel and Jordan and Israel are all a threatening posture, and the potential of war is often rumored. So we live in a day where wars and rumors of wars are definitely increasing. Now, the I-24 news reports something that, again, it's a bit difficult to hear and read, but it's happening all around the world, and it's happening here in the United States, specifically according to this article, and that is sharp decline in support for Israel among U.S. evangelical Christians who are young. Now, a growing generational divide in favorable attitudes towards Israel among U.S. evangelical Christians was highlighted by a recent poll, potentially forecasting a significant drop in support for the country. The poll, conducted by researchers at the University of North Carolina, questioned 700 evangelical Christians aged between 18 and 29 and was carried out in preparation for an upcoming book. Israel has increasingly relied upon the support of the U.S., this U.S. voting group who views the country favorably for religious reasons. The findings could indicate the loss of an important ally for Israel, and the researchers reported this to the Times of Israel. The apparent trend among evangelical Christians mirrors a similar generational divergence of opinion regarding the Israeli-Palestinian conflict among U.S. Jews. Between March and April, respondents were asked where they placed their support in the Israeli-Palestinian dispute, and support for Israel was backed by 33.6% of those questioned. 24.3% sided with the Palestinians, while 42.2% indicated a neutral response. The findings differ widely from similar questioning conducted by the same researchers in 2018, where 75% of the respondents favored in this issue sided with Israel over the Palestinians. At that time, less than 3% expressed any degree of support for the Palestinians. Now, again, this points to the indoctrinations that's taking place of that age group between 18 and 29. That's the the prime bracket for attending college, age bracket for attending college. And it also reveals that egalitarian thinking and the equality of outcome. And this is one of the strange things that we've been seeing in news reporting in recent days, and that is Israel has been accused of disproportionate responses to uh, 4,000 rockets being fired into their territory or being fired at them at least, and Israel responding with taking out these rocket sites, the places where they fire them, and they hide their rocket launchers often near an elementary school or in residential districts. And, sadly, there are the loss of civilian lives when these things take place, but nobody says anything about where, at least in the liberal media, where these launchers are placed. They simply say that Israel's response is disproportionate. And in their mind, the casualties, so to speak, or consequences have to be equal on both sides. In the thinking of many today, there can't be a winner. No one can be decisive in victory. Everybody has to have the equal outcome. In other words, if they're sending incendiary devices into Israel and starting the 26 fires that have burned since the flag parade, Israel cannot respond in any way that is disproportionate to that. Their response has to be equal. And that's really what we've been seeing in this indoctrination process, where you've got a large percentage of high school graduates now who cannot read at an elementary grade level. And it's not fair to say somebody failed. It's not fair to hold somebody back a grade. It's not fair to demand somebody actually accomplish what the schools are supposed to be trying to teach them. Everything has to be equal. Everybody has to graduate. We've all heard the story of the participation trophies at the soccer games and other young children's sporting events, where everybody gets a trophy just for participating. And this is moving up the ladder. And now it's finding its way into the thinking of those who can go to the voting booth and cast their vote. Now, at least we can find a little bit of positivity going on in the world, and this next story gives it to us. Christian Headline says the Florida governor signs bill requiring moment of silence in schools. He is quoted as saying, "You can't be successful without God." On Monday, Florida Governor Ron DeSantis signed a bill into law requiring public school classrooms to hold a 1-minute moment of silence at the beginning of each day to give students an opportunity for quiet reflection. The bill, HB 529, requires teachers in first period classes in all grades to reserve at least 1 minute, but not more than 2, during which students may not interfere with other students' participation. The new law says teachers may not make suggestions for the moment of silence. It also encourages parents or guardians to discuss with their children the best use of this time. The word prayer is not in the new law, although the text of the law allows for prayer. In today's hectic society, too few persons are able to experience even a moment of quiet reflection before plunging headlong into the activities of daily life, the text of the new law says. Young persons are particularly affected by the absence of an opportunity for a moment of quiet reflection. The legislature finds that our youth and society as a whole would be well served if students in the public schools were afforded a moment of silence at the beginning of each day. DeSantis, a Republican, said the new law is needed. Every family in our state should be able to send their children to school and know that they will be protected from harm and be able to practice their faith, DeSantis said. He said during a press conference, the idea that you can just push God out of every institution and you can be successful is something that our founding fathers did not believe in. Well, kudos for Governor DeSantis. And obviously, I agree wholeheartedly that prayer is essential. And I like the old saying that as long as there are tests, there will be prayer in schools, but it should be legal as well. Now, interesting as we see things happening and heating up and around the world, it's also heating up literally. And this multiple news sources are reporting that extreme heat in the West could break 200 records and produce temperatures up to 127 degrees. Dozens of daily records were set Monday as highs soared into the 90s and hit triple digits across cities in the western part of the country, stretching all the way to the Canadian border. Denver hit 101. Montana's capital, Helena, reached a sizzling 104. Records in Salt Lake City and Billings, Montana, were broken by 5 degrees or more. The article says record highs are typically only broken by 1 or 2 degrees. So the fact that many were obliterated by large margins speaks to the intensity of the heat that's baking that part of the country. And there's not much relief in sight, as the extreme heat across the West will only intensify and become more widespread throughout the rest of the week. The article says about 200 million people are projected to experience temperatures over 90 degrees. That's almost 2/3 of the U.S. population over the next 7 days, and 40 million over 100 degrees. Now, Bloomberg reports that California is walking a tightrope as hydropower supply fades, and the catastrophic drought that's gripping the U.S. West is claiming a new victim, the hydropower dams that much of the region depends on for electricity supplies. Low water levels in key reservoirs mean that hydropower supplies are declining. One of the hardest hit areas is California, where output has tumbled to the lowest in more than 5 years. Nationally, the U.S. Energy Information Administration predicts electricity generation from conventional hydro sources will drop about 11% this year from 2020. And that's at a time when electric grids across the West are already forecast to be stretched this summer as heat waves send power demand surging. With less hydropower, the challenge of meeting peak demand may get even tougher, especially in California. Now, I think this is interesting on a couple of levels, and let me just conclude with this last story that comes from the Business Insider. Kim Jong-un warns that North Korea is running out of food supplies and reports that a bunch of bananas, a single bunch, now cost $45. Kim Jong-un has warned that North Korea is struggling to maintain food supplies, as reports say cost of everyday goods are skyrocketing. And speaking at a party meeting Tuesday, Kim said the food situation was getting tense because of grain shortages brought about by typhoons last year, according to the state-run Korean Central News Agency. Experts have warned over the past month that food was running short in North Korea. Now, I say this for this reason. We know that during the tribulation period, that there's going to be a major food shortage like the world has never seen. We also know, according to Revelation chapter 11, that the two witnesses are going to shut up the skies and there will be no rain. Again, further aggravating this problem of food shortages. Now, those are supernatural events. There's no question about this. But these stories with the heat rising here in California on the West Coast, the loss of water, the energy depletion, at least the ability to supply it, especially now coming into the summer. Here we're having, a pretty major heat wave as I speak right now in California. We've seen some mid-90s here in the month of June, where we normally experience what's called June gloom. And things are reminding us that there is coming a time where weather changes are going to play a role in what happens on the earth. Now, again, I want to point out the fact that I don't think that this is something that's necessarily gradually going to take place where we just reach a point where, it just stops raining, because Genesis tells us in 8:22 that seed time and harvest and the hydrologic cycle is going to continue as long as the Lord is on the throne, and he is and will remain there. But this is going to be a supernatural intervention that takes place during the tribulation. But we need to remember that here you've got, and this article goes on to say that a bunch of bananas, by definition, is 7. So 7 bananas cost $45. That's almost $7 per banana. And again, that equates to what we know is going to happen during the tribulation, where a quart of wheat is going to cost a day's pay. So this is just a reminder that we're headed towards a tribulation period. Prices are going to skyrocket. There'll be food shortages around the world. But the most important thing for you and I to remember as born-again Christians is that we're going to miss it all. The other thing we need to remember is that we have the responsibility to tell others how they can miss it too. come into a personal relationship with Jesus, be born again, and have their sin forgiven, and know that their eternal destiny is indeed in heaven with the Lord. So these are our stories for this week. There's a multitude of things we could have covered and simply can't cover them all, but hopefully we touched a few bases there and gave us a broad picture of what's happening around the world as it relates to Bible prophecy. So once again, I'd ask you to go to YouTube, look up my name or The Truth About God, and subscribe there and hit the notifications bell so you're notified of when these things will air. And hopefully in the coming weeks, we'll be able to do a few short updates as well in between our weekly broadcast. And again, if you're interested, we're going to do a 6-part series over the summer months at Calvary Chapel Tustin, cctustin.org, or you can watch on the CC Tustin, Calvary Chapel Tustin Facebook page or my Facebook page. And then we will post these on YouTube regarding Bible prophecy. And our first on July 14th at 7 p.m. Pacific time, our first message will be titled in our Time of the Sign series, Born in a Day, Israel, God's Timepiece. So I'm Barry Stagner. Thank you again for watching. Thank you for your kind comments and your encouragement. And I hope today was insightful for you. And Lord willing, we'll see you next week.